Somewhere beneath St. Peter's Basilica, there's a crypt. It's January, the year is 897, and in the middle of the night, a group of men are descending into that crypt with torches. They aren't here to pray, they aren't here to mourn. They've been given a direct order by the most powerful man in the Christian world, the Pope himself. Their job is simple: go into the crypt, open the sarcophagus, and bring out what's inside. And what's inside is a body that's been dead for 9 months. The flesh has begun to collapse. The stench is beyond anything these men have ever experienced. And what they do next will haunt the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. They don't bury the body. They don't move it to another tomb. They carry it across Rome in the dead of the night. They bring it to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the most important church in all of Christendom. They dress up the corpse, golden robes, the pallium, the papal mitre. They prop it up on a throne because tomorrow morning, this dead man has a court date. And what happens next in the Basilica, in front of cardinals and the bishops and the full machinery of the medieval church, is one of the most disturbing events in religious history, and almost nobody's heard of it. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod. But before we continue, the Midnight Archives exist for one reason, and that's to find the stories they buried, the ones too dark to be told during the day. They buried this one for a reason, and now we're going to dig it up. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe and like this video, and I'll keep the candle lit. Now, let's head into that crypt. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Chapter 1. The most dangerous job in Europe. Before we get to the corpse on the throne, you need to understand the world that made it possible. Because in the 9th century, the papacy wasn't a spiritual office, it was a battlefield, and almost everyone who sat on that throne ended up dead.
To understand why anyone would dig up a dead pope and put his corpse on trial, you need to understand one thing first. Being the pope in the 9th century was not a spiritual calling. It was a death sentence. The Rome of 897 looked nothing like the Rome you imagine. The Grand Empire had been gone for 400 years. The aqueducts were crumbling. The forums were overgrown with weeds. Entire neighborhoods stood abandoned, their marble stripped away and repurposed as building material. The population had shrunk from over 1 million at its peak to somewhere around 20 or 30,000. Wolves roamed the outer districts after dark. In 846, an Arab fleet had sailed up the Tiber and sacked the outskirts of Rome. Saracen raiders had broken into the old Basilica of St. Peter itself and stripped the silver from the tomb of the first apostle. The psychological shock was immense. The holiest site in Western Christianity had been violated by an enemy that most Romans hadn't even believed could reach them. Pope Leo IV responded by building a massive fortified wall around the Vatican, the Leonine Wall, turning the spiritual heart of Christianity into a literal fortress. That wall tells you everything. The Pope lived behind fortifications because he needed them, not against foreign invaders, against the people and factions supposedly on his own side. And the papacy, the institution that was supposed to be the moral center of the Western world, had become the single most dangerous political office in Europe. This was not the era of gentle old men in white robes waving from balconies. This was the era when a pope's most likely cause of death was murder. In 872, Pope Adrian II died under circumstances nobody bothered to investigate. His successor, John VIII, lasted 10 years, until the night someone slipped poison into his communion wine. When the poison didn't work fast enough, they finished the job with a hammer to the skull. Let that sit for a moment. The Pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, poisoned, then beaten to death with a hammer in his own chambers. by members of his own court. And John VIII's death didn't even cause a scandal. It was just Tuesday in 9th century Rome. His successor, Marinus I, lasted 2 years before dying. The man after him, Adrian III, didn't even make it to 12 months. He died on the road to Germany under circumstances that nobody at the time felt the need to explain. To understand why, you need to understand what the papacy actually was in this period. The Pope had one power that every warlord, noble family, and foreign king wanted to control. He could crown the Holy Roman Emperor. In an age when legitimacy came from God, that crown was everything. It meant your dynasty was chosen. It meant your wars were holy. It meant your enemies were enemies of the church itself. Whoever controlled the Pope controlled the crown. And whoever controlled the crown controlled Europe. 2 factions were locked in a war over this prize. On one side, the Carolingians. The crumbling dynasty descended from Charlemagne. Their empire was fracturing into smaller and smaller pieces, but they still believed the imperial title belonged to them by blood. On the other, the Spoletans, an Italian noble family based in the Duchy of Spoleto, led by a warlord named Guy III and his wife, the formidable Empress Agiltrude. They didn't have Charlemagne's blood, but they had something better, an army camped outside Rome's walls and a willingness to use it. Between these 2 forces, the popes were being ground to dust. In the 30 years between 872 and 904, Rome burned through nearly 24 popes. Some lasted years, many lasted months. A few didn't make it past a fortnight. They were poisoned, deposed, imprisoned, exiled, and strangled. The papal throne had become less a seat of spiritual authority and more a chair that killed whoever sat in it. And into this bloodbath walked a man named Formosus. He was a bishop, a diplomat, a missionary who had converted entire kingdoms to Christianity. He was old, he was tired, and his name, Formosus, is Latin. It means beautiful. He had no way of knowing that one day, 9 months after his heart stopped beating, his rotting corpse would be dragged from its grave, dressed in gold, and propped up on a throne to stand trial for crimes he had supposedly committed while alive. But to understand how that happened, you first need to understand who Formosus was, what he did, who he made angry, and why his enemies decided that killing him once wasn't enough.
Chapter 2. The man they couldn't keep down. Now you know the world, let me introduce you to the man at the center of it, a bishop who was exiled, excommunicated, and left for dead, and somehow clawed his way back to the most powerful seat in the Christian world. His name was Formosus, and the enemies he made along the way would follow him beyond the grave.
Formosus was born around the year 816. He was most likely a Roman, though the records of 9th century births are, to put it politely, unreliable. What we know for certain is that by the age of 48, he had risen to become the Cardinal Bishop of Porto, the ancient port town at the mouth of the Tiber, just outside Rome. This was not a small appointment. Porto was one of the most important dioceses in the church, and its bishop held a seat among the most senior clergy in Christendom. Formosus had been placed there by Pope Nicholas I, a man known for being fiercely independent and deeply suspicious of anyone who got too popular. And Formosus was getting popular. In 866, Nicholas sent Formosus on a mission to Bulgaria. The Bulgarians had recently converted to Christianity, and their king, Boris I, wanted Rome to send its best to organize the new church. Formosus was that man. He arrived, he preached, he ordained priests, he built the institutional framework of an entire national church, practically from scratch. He was so effective that Boris made an extraordinary request. He asked Pope Nicholas to appoint Formosus as the permanent Archbishop of Bulgaria. Now, this sounds like a promotion, and in some ways it was. Bulgaria was vast, a sprawling territory stretching from the Danube to the Balkans, sitting right on the fault line between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. Whoever controlled its church controlled a strategic prize that both Rome and Constantinople desperately wanted. The Archbishop would be one of the most influential clerics in Europe. It would have made Formosus a kingmaker. But here's where it gets complicated. In the 9th century, the church had a rule. A bishop could not change dioceses. You were married to your see, your assigned territory, the same way a husband was married to his wife. You couldn't leave, you couldn't transfer, you couldn't climb the ladder to a bigger, richer, more powerful position. To do so was called transmigration, and it was a violation of canon law. So the request was denied. Formosus stayed at Porto, but the damage was done. People had noticed. Formosus was ambitious. He wanted more. And in the cutthroat politics of 9th century Rome, ambition was the most dangerous thing a bishop could have. When Pope John VIII took the papal throne in 872, Formosus initially had his trust. John even sent him on diplomatic missions to France. But suspicion crept in slowly, then all at once. John became convinced that Formosus was building a power base, that he was making alliances with rival factions, that he had his eyes on the papal throne itself. In 876, John brought the hammer down. He convened a synod, a formal church council, and charged Formosus with a litany of offences: deserting his diocese, plotting against the papacy, conspiring with enemies of the church. When Formosus refused to appear, John excommunicated him, stripped him of every title, cast him out of the church entirely. Formosus fled Rome. He spent years wandering the Frankish kingdoms, a bishop without a church, a priest without a congregation, an old man without a home. The conditions of his pardon, when it finally came in 878, were humiliating. He was allowed to rejoin the church as a layman only, no longer a bishop, no longer a priest, and he had to swear an oath that he would never return to Rome and never again attempt to exercise any priestly function. Think about what that means. A man who had converted an entire nation to Christianity, who had been one of the most respected diplomats in the church, was now forbidden from saying Mass, forbidden from entering the city where he had spent his entire career. He was 62 years old, and everything he had built had been taken from him. Most men in that position would have been forgotten. Their names would have disappeared from history. They would have died in some village on the wrong side of the Alps, and nobody would have noticed. Formosus didn't die. He waited. And in 882, the man who had destroyed his career, Pope John VIII, was murdered. Poisoned first. Then, when the poison failed to kill him quickly enough, bludgeoned to death with a hammer. The new pope, Marinus I, had a different opinion of Formosus. He lifted the excommunication. He restored Formosus to his diocese at Porto. He invited him back to Rome. Formosus came home. He resumed his duties at Porto. He kept his head down. He watched from the sidelines as the papal throne consumed man after man. Pope Adrian III lasted barely a year before dying under suspicious circumstances on a journey to Germany. Pope Stephen V followed and managed 6 years, a genuine achievement in an era when most popes were lucky to see their first anniversary. And in 891, after 2 more popes had come and gone, the Church elected a new leader. They chose Formosus. The man who had been excommunicated, exiled, and left for dead was now the Pope. He was approximately 75 years old. It should have been a triumph, the ultimate vindication. After 30 years of political warfare, Formosus had outlasted every enemy, survived every betrayal, and climbed to the highest seat in the Christian world. But the throne he had inherited was a trap. The Spoletans were at the gates. Guy III of Spoleto, the most powerful warlord in Italy, had already forced the previous pope to crown him Holy Roman Emperor. Guy's army had occupied large swathes of the Italian peninsula. His wife, the Empress Agiltrude, was by all accounts as ruthless as her husband, perhaps more so. Together, they had turned the papacy into their personal rubber stamp, and they expected Formosus to be no different. Guy demanded that Formosus crown his son, Lambert, as co-emperor. The subtext was clear. This wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the implicit threat of violence. Formosus had seen what happened to popes who defied powerful families. He had watched John VIII get his skull caved in with a hammer. Formosus crowned Lambert. He had no choice. But he hadn't survived 30 years of Roman politics by being obedient. While performing the coronation with one hand, he was writing letters with the other. Secretly, he began reaching out across the Alps. He was contacting Arnulf of Carinthia, the Carolingian king of Germany and the most powerful military leader north of the mountains. Formosus was inviting Arnulf to invade Italy, to march his army south through Tuscany, smash through the Spoletan forces, enter Rome, and claim the imperial crown for himself. It was the most dangerous gamble of his life. If the Spoletans discovered what he was doing before Arnulf arrived, Formosus would be dead within the week. He was betraying the most powerful family in Italy while sitting in a chair that had gotten the last several occupants killed. The first invasion attempt in 894 stalled. Arnulf's forces took northern Italy but couldn't push further south. Guy III died that December, a small mercy. But his son Lambert remained, and the Empress Agiltrude held the faction together with an iron grip. Formosus tried again. He sent more letters, more promises, the imperial crown itself as the prize. In 896, Arnulf crossed the Alps for the second time. This time, his army pushed all the way to Rome. The gates were opened by Formosus's allies or by the people themselves, depending on which source you trust. Arnulf entered the city, and on the 22nd of February, 896, Formosus crowned Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor. It was the boldest act of his papacy. In one ceremony, he had voided the crown he had given Lambert, declared the Spoletan claim to the empire illegitimate, and allied the papacy irrevocably with the Carolingian faction. There was no going back. If the Spoletans regained power, Formosus was a dead man. And then everything fell apart. Arnulf was struck down, whether by stroke, by poison, or by some mysterious illness that medieval chroniclers could not diagnose. The Carolingian king collapsed. His body betrayed him the way Formosus's body would soon be betrayed, suddenly, completely, without warning. Arnulf's army, leaderless and far from home, began to retreat. The greatest military force north of the Alps withdrew from Italy in a matter of weeks. Formosus was alone. The Spoletans were regrouping. Lambert and Agiltrude were already marching back toward Rome, and this time there was no Frankish army between them and the papal throne. Formosus had staked everything on Arnulf, and Arnulf was paralyzed in a castle somewhere in Bavaria, unable to feed himself. On the 4th of April, 896, Pope Formosus died. Most likely of a stroke, though given the timing and the circumstances, some historians have quietly wondered if the cause was more deliberate. He was roughly 80 years old. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica with full papal honors. His body was laid to rest in a stone sarcophagus. Prayers were said. Incense was burned, and the Christian world moved on, or so everyone thought. His successor, Pope Boniface VI, lasted 15 days. Some say he died of gout, others say poison. In 9th century Rome, the line between the two was razor thin, and the man who took the throne next, Pope Stephen VI, had been waiting for exactly this moment. Stephen owed everything to Formosus. Formosus had made him a bishop, but Stephen also owed everything to the Spoletans. Lambert and his mother, the Empress Agiltrude, had returned to Rome. They had backed Stephen's election. They had put him on the papal throne, and they wanted revenge on the man who had betrayed them, even though that man was dead, especially because he was dead. Because here's the thing, Formosus had crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor. If that coronation stood, then Lambert's claim to the imperial throne was worthless. But if Formosus could be proven to have been an illegitimate pope, if his entire papacy could be retroactively declared null and void, then every act he performed as pope would be erased, including Arnulf's coronation. Lambert would once again be the only legitimate emperor. All Stephen had to do was put a dead man on trial and convict him. The trial was never about justice. It was never about canon law. It was about a crown. And it had to be public. It had to be spectacular. It couldn't be a quiet decree issued from a back room. The whole point was to humiliate Formosus so thoroughly, so viscerally, that no one would ever dare invoke his name or his authority again. So Stephen gave the order: open the tomb, bring out the body, dress it in papal vestments, bring it to the Lateran. We're going to put a corpse on trial.
Chapter 3. The Synodus Horrenda. This is the part of the story people don't believe when they first hear it. I need you to understand, everything I'm about to describe actually happened. This isn't a legend. This is not exaggeration. This was a formal proceeding of the Catholic Church, and it is, without a question, the most disturbing trial in the history of Western civilization.
The Basilica of St. John Lateran still stands in Rome today. It is the oldest and highest ranking of the 4 papal basilicas. It is the official cathedral of the Bishop of Rome, which is to say, the official cathedral of the Pope. For over 1,000 years, it was where the most important ceremonies of the Catholic Church took place. On a morning in January 897, it became the site of the most grotesque spectacle in the history of Christianity. The Latins had a name for what happened that day. They called it the Synodus Horrenda, the horrible synod. The full machinery of ecclesiastical justice had been assembled. Every cardinal in Rome was present, every bishop, every dignitary of the church. This was not some backroom kangaroo court. This was a formal trial, with formal charges, formal proceedings, and a formal verdict. Pope Stephen VI presided from his throne. Accounts describe his face as contorted, his voice as unhinged. Some historians have speculated that Stephen may have been mentally unstable. Others believe he was perfectly sane and simply terrified, a puppet dancing for the Spolatans, knowing that if he didn't perform, he would be the next pope to die in a prison cell. But the defendant is what everyone remembers. They had dressed the corpse of Pope Formosus in full pontifical vestments, the gold-threaded robes, the pallium draped across his shoulders, the mitre on his head, the ring on his finger. The body had been in the ground since April. It was now January, 9 months of decomposition in a stone sarcophagus. The skin had darkened and pulled tight in some places, sagged and split in others. The jaw had gone slack long ago. The eyes were gone. The smell, in an enclosed basilica, with hundreds of bodies heating the air, must have been staggering. Some accounts suggest the stench was so severe that attendees held cloths over their faces throughout the proceedings, and there, propped up on a throne, held upright only because someone was standing behind it, keeping it from toppling forward, sat the corpse of Pope Formosus, dressed in the most sacred garments in the Christian world, his name, in bitter irony, meaning beautiful. On the other side of the room, the living Pope screamed at the dead one. Standing behind the corpse was a teenage deacon, a young man, barely more than a boy, who had been assigned the most unimaginable task in the history of the church. He was Formosus's defense counsel. His job was to answer the charges on behalf of the dead man. He said almost nothing. He couldn't. Nobody could speak when Stephen was in the room, because Stephen wasn't interested in a defense. Stephen was interested in a performance. According to the 10th century historian Liutprand of Cremona, Stephen rose from his throne and addressed the corpse directly. He screamed at it. He demanded answers from it. "When you were Bishop of Porto," Stephen shrieked, "why did you usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of ambition?" The corpse did not answer. Stephen screamed louder. The charges were read. Perjury, violating canon law by holding multiple bishoprics simultaneously, the same offence that had gotten Formosus excommunicated decades earlier under John VIII. Illegally ascending to the papacy. Every accusation that had ever been thrown at Formosus in life was now thrown at his corpse in death. And here is the detail that historians have puzzled over for centuries. Stephen himself was guilty of the exact same crime. Formosus had ordained Stephen as a bishop, and Stephen had then become Pope, Bishop of Rome, while still technically holding his original bishopric. That was transmigration, the exact offence he was charging Formosus with. But if Formosus could be declared an illegitimate pope, if his entire papacy could be erased, then every ordination he had performed would be invalid, which meant Stephen had never really been made a bishop by Formosus, which meant he wasn't guilty of holding 2 bishoprics at once when he became pope. He was putting a dead man on trial for his own sins. The teenage deacon behind the corpse offered what meagre defense he could. The accounts suggest he was terrified. Liutprand notes that Stephen, overawed the assemblage with his frenzied tirades. The clergy sat in horrified silence, watching a pope scream accusations at a decomposing body. And then, in the middle of the trial, the ground moved. An earthquake shook the Basilica of St. John Lateran. The walls cracked. Part of the structure collapsed. Later, chroniclers would write that the very stones of the church were crying out against the abomination happening inside. For the stones themselves, one contemporary source recorded, execrating such a monstrosity, then cried out with their own voice, by knocking against each other, that they would more willingly suffer spontaneous ruin than that the Roman Church should remain depressed by so great a scandal. God, it seemed, had spoken. Stephen ignored it. The verdict was guilty, on all counts. Pope Formosus's entire papacy was declared null and void. Every ordination he had ever performed was retroactively erased. Every appointment he had made was cancelled. Every blessing he had given was meaningless. Hundreds of priests and bishops across Europe who owed their positions to Formosus were suddenly, legally, no longer priests and bishops. The sacraments they had administered, the baptisms, the marriages, the last rites, were all, in the eyes of the Church, invalid. One dead man's conviction had thrown the entire institutional framework of Western Christianity into chaos. But Stephen wasn't finished. They stripped the papal vestments from the corpse. They tore the gold robes away and replaced them with common rags. Then they took a blade and cut 3 fingers from his right hand. The 3 fingers Formosus had used in life to perform consecrations and blessings. The fingers that had anointed kings and ordained bishops. The Annales Alemanni, the contemporary German chronicle, records what happened next in language that still feels raw 11 centuries later. And his apostolic vestment was stripped off and dragged across the basilica, and blood was flowing from his mouth, and he was thrown into the river. They buried the mutilated corpse in a pauper's grave outside the city walls, a cemetery reserved for foreigners and criminals. No prayers, no incense, no name on the stone. But a few days later, Stephen changed his mind. A pauper's grave wasn't enough. People could still find it. People could still venerate it. In the medieval world, a dead man's body was a relic, a source of miraculous power. As long as Formosus's body existed somewhere, it could become a rallying point. Stephen ordered the body dug up again. This was now the 3rd time Formosus had been pulled from the earth. They carried the corpse to the banks of the Tiber River, and they threw it in. In the medieval understanding, a body consigned to the river was gone forever. No burial site meant no shrine. No shrine meant no pilgrims. No pilgrims meant no miracles. Stephen had not just convicted Formosus. He had tried to erase him from existence. But the Tiber is a long river, and it doesn't always keep what it's given.
Chapter 4. The Dead Man's Revenge. So they convicted him, they mutilated him, and threw his body into a river, and that should have been the end. But here's where the story takes a turn that even I wasn't expecting when I first researched it, because the dead man fought back.
The stories differ on who found the body. Some sources say it was a fisherman, others say it was a monk. Either way, within days of being thrown into the Tiber, the body of Pope Formosus washed ashore. It had been exhumed, dressed in gold, screamed at, convicted, stripped, mutilated, buried, exhumed again, and thrown into a river. and it came back. According to Liutprand of Cremona, one of the most important chroniclers of this period, what happened next crossed the line from history into something stranger. When the body was recovered and brought to a church, the statues of the saints bowed their heads in the presence of the corpse. Liutprand wrote, "When he was afterwards found by fishermen and carried to the church of the Blessed Prince of the Apostles, certain images of the saints, with veneration, saluted him." Whether you believe the statues moved or not, what matters is that the people of Rome believed it, and the effect was devastating. Rumors began spreading through the city. The dead pope was performing miracles. The body that Stephen had desecrated, convicted and thrown away like refuse, that body was being touched by God. The very thing Stephen had tried to prevent was happening. Formosus was becoming a relic. Public opinion, which had been uncertain during the trial, turned violently against Stephen. The Cadaver Synod hadn't demonstrated Stephen's authority. It had demonstrated his insanity. The clergy who had sat in terrified silence during the trial began to speak openly against him. The Roman people, who had endured decades of papal chaos, murder, and instability, decided they had finally seen enough. There was also a practical dimension to the outrage. Stephen's verdict hadn't just defiled a corpse. It had invalidated every ordination Formosus had ever performed. That meant hundreds of priests across Italy, Germany, and France had suddenly been told they weren't really priests. Every mass they had said, every confession they had heard, every dying person they had given last rites to, all of it was now, technically, meaningless. The theological chaos was staggering. Ordinary Christians, people who had nothing to do with Roman politics, were suddenly being told that the baptism of their children might not count. Stephen had taken his personal vendetta against a dead man and turned it into a crisis that touched every parish in Europe. What happened next was fast. A mob formed, not peasants with pitchforks. This was Rome, and Roman mobs had a political sophistication born of centuries of practice. This was a coordinated uprising. Stephen's allies abandoned him. The people stormed the papal residence. Pope Stephen VI was seized. They stripped him of his papal vestments, a deliberate echo of what he had done to Formosus's corpse. They threw him into a prison cell. And sometime in July or August of 897, less than a year after he had put a dead man on trial, Pope Stephen VI was strangled to death in that cell. He died the same way Formosus had sat on that throne, voiceless, powerless, and at the mercy of forces he could not control. The people of Rome had rendered their verdict, and unlike the Cadaver Synod, there was no appeal. What followed was a period of papal succession so rapid it reads like a fever dream. Stephen's immediate successor, Pope Romanus, lasted 92 days before being deposed. The man after him, Pope Theodore II, lasted just 20 days. But in those 20 days, Theodore accomplished something extraordinary. He recovered Formosus's body from wherever it had been hidden since washing ashore. He convened a synod that annulled every decision made at the Cadaver Synod. He declared Formosus's papacy valid. He declared all his ordinations legitimate. And he ordered the body reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full pontifical honors. Formosus was home. In 898, the next pope, John IX, went even further. He convened 2 synods, one in Rome and one in Ravenna. Both formally condemned the Cadaver Synod. Both declared everything Stephen had done to be an abomination. John ordered the official records of the trial to be gathered up and burned. And then John IX did something no pope had ever needed to do before. He issued a decree banning the church from ever putting a dead person on trial again. The fact that such a law needed to exist tells you everything about what the 9th century was. The body was buried. The trial was annulled. The man who ordered it was dead. The records were burned. It should have been over. But the church wasn't finished with Formosus yet.
Chapter 5, a name no pope will ever take again. You'd think the story ends there. Justice served, body buried, case closed. But the church wasn't done with Formosus, and the legacy of what happened in that basilica would poison the papacy for the next 60 years.
7 years after the Cadaver Synod was condemned and its records burned, a new pope took the throne. His name was Sergius III, and Sergius had been in the room during the original trial. He had supported Stephen. He had wanted Formosus destroyed. Now he had the power to finish the job. Sergius reinstated the guilty verdict against Formosus. Once again, every ordination Formosus had performed was declared invalid. Once again, priests and bishops across Europe who owed their positions to Formosus were plunged into uncertainty. Once again, the sacraments those clergy had administered, every baptism, every marriage, every funeral rite, were technically void. Sergius's own papacy would become one of the most notorious in history. He allegedly fathered a son with a teenage noblewoman named Marozia, a woman who would go on to become one of the most powerful figures in Rome. The era that followed Sergius is so steeped in corruption, scandal, and sexual intrigue that historians gave it an actual name. They call it the pornocracy. That is not a joke. That is the real academic term for the period of papal history that the Cadaver Synod helped usher in. For nearly 60 years after the trial, the papacy was controlled by Roman noble families who installed and deposed popes at will. Several were murdered. At least one was a teenager when elected. The office that was supposed to represent the moral authority of God on earth had become a commodity, bought, sold, and occasionally stolen at knife point. And it all started here, in a basilica, with a dead man on a throne and a living man screaming at him. But Sergius's revenge on Formosus didn't last. Later, popes overturned his verdict, just as Theodore and John had overturned Stephen's. The ordinations were declared valid again. The chaos subsided, and eventually the Catholic Church settled on its final answer regarding Formosus. He was a legitimate pope. His ordination stood. His papacy counted. He won. If you visit St. Peter's Basilica today, you can find a stone monument that lists every pope buried within its walls. The names stretch back centuries, and there, carved into the stone, is the name Formosus. Over 1100 years after they dug up his body, dressed it in gold, screamed at it, convicted it, mutilated it, and threw it in a river. His name is still on that wall. They tried to erase him. They failed. But here's the thing that haunts me about this story. And it's not the trial itself. It's not the earthquake. It's not the corpse on the throne. It's the question of why. Not why Stephen did it. We know why Stephen did it. Politics, ambition, fear, survival. the usual reasons men do terrible things. The question is deeper than that. It's about what Stephen believed he was doing when he put a dead man on trial. In the 9th century, the dead were not gone. Not really. A dead person's body was a relic, an object of miraculous power. Saints' bones healed the sick. The remains of holy men blessed the crops, authenticated justice, protected cities from plague and invasion. Every church in Europe contained relics. Every altar was built over a fragment of bone or a scrap of cloth that had touched a holy body. Relics were traded, stolen, fought over, and occasionally faked. Wars were waged over the possession of a single finger bone. The Pope's authority didn't just come from his office. It came from his guardianship of the physical body of St. Peter. The bones of the first apostle were the foundation, literally, architecturally, spiritually, of everything the papacy was. St. Peter's Basilica was not named after an abstract idea. It was built over a body. The power came from the bones. So when Stephen put Formosus on trial, he wasn't performing an empty ritual. He wasn't acting out some political theater that everyone understood to be symbolic. In his world, in the world of 9th century Rome, what he was doing was terrifyingly real. He was trying to kill a man who was already dead. Not his body, his presence, his continued existence in the world of the living. By destroying the body, by throwing it in the river, by making it impossible for anyone to venerate his remains, Stephen was trying to sever the last thread that connected Formosus to the living world. And the Tiber gave the body back, and the icons bowed, and the people remembered. Power always believes it can rewrite the past. Every tyrant, every institution, every empire that has ever existed has tried to control not just the present, but the story of what came before. They burn the records. They tear down the statues. They rewrite the books. And sometimes it works. Sometimes the past stays buried, but not always. Not with Formosus. Because the most powerful institution in the medieval world, an institution that commanded the loyalty of kings and the faith of millions, put all of its weight behind destroying one dead man. It dug up his body. It put his corpse on trial. It cut off his fingers. It threw him in a river. It burned the records. It did everything within its considerable power to make this man disappear. And today, if you walk into St. Peter's Basilica and look at that stone wall, you'll find his name, Formosus, Latin for beautiful, the dead man who won. There's one final detail. In over 1,000 years of papal history, over 260 popes, not a single one has ever taken the name Formosus. Not because the name is forbidden, not because there's a rule against it. Popes choose their own names when they ascend to the throne, and there's nothing stopping any of them from choosing Formosus. But nobody wants to remind the Church of what it did. Nobody wants to sit in that chair and carry the name of the man they put on trial and couldn't defeat. The name has become a kind of scar, unspoken but present. A reminder that power tried to rewrite the past, and the past pushed back. Some scars don't heal, not even in 1,000 years, not even for an institution that claims to speak for God.
That's the Cadaver Synod, the real one, the one the Catholic Church spent 11 centuries trying to forget. A dead man dragged from his grave, dressed in gold, propped up on a throne, screamed at by the most powerful man in the Christian world, convicted, mutilated, thrown in a river, and the river gave him back. The man who did it was strangled in a prison cell within a year, the verdict was overturned, the records were burned, and Formosus, the man whose name means beautiful, is still buried in St. Peter's Basilica today. His name is still on the wall. They tried to erase him from history, and history said no. If this changed the way you see the Catholic Church, subscribe to the Midnight Archives, where we illuminate the dark corners of history, the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Until next time, keep the candle lit.